Hello, and welcome to the first lecture in my class, Psychological Aspects of Drug Use and Abuse. Now, some of you watching this video are enrolled in the class, PSYC 212, at North Dakota State University. Some of you may be just watching this video on YouTube. Either way, welcome, and I hope you find this lecture interesting, and indeed the lectures that follow and the rest of the content for the class interesting as well. Now in today's lecture I want to briefly describe what we'll be covering in this semester, but before I get there I'd like to highlight a few interesting news articles that have to do with drugs. The first of these is a news story that comes out of West Fargo, and that's actually just a few days ago, or at least before I recorded this video, and it concerns the sale of fentanyl at the West Fargo and Cheyenne high schools. Now, as you may already know, fentanyl is an opioid analgesic. Opioids are a class of drugs which are chemically or pharmacologically related to opium. Analgesics are a class of drugs which are used to treat pain. So combination of the two, you get a sense of what fentanyl does. It's a drug that's used to manage acute pain or sometimes to manage breakthrough pain. That's a situation in which you're experiencing pain that's being fairly well controlled by another drug, perhaps another opiate, but you're still having intermittent pain that kind of breaks through the management and puts you into suffering. If that's the case, your doctor may prescribe fentanyl to be used to manage that breakthrough pain. Fentanyl is also sometimes combined with other drugs, particularly benzodiazepines, and used for anesthesia during surgeries. It's an interesting drug. It's a useful drug, at least medically speaking, because it has relatively fast onset and a relatively short duration. So it's good for treating quickly, but not for very long, a sudden bout of pain or pain during a relatively brief episode in time. However, like many drugs in its class, indeed like many drugs generally speaking, there are some risks. And in the case of fentanyl, there are some serious risks of overdose on the drug which can lead to coma or even death. It's certainly something that we're concerned about here in this region, as are people in many regions around the country. The rise in the use and misuse of prescription drugs, especially opioid analgesics, is a significant public health problem and has been so for at least the last couple decades. Interestingly, the drug that's being sold in West Fargo is furanyl fentanyl, which is a chemical analog of the drug fentanyl. Chemical analogs are drugs which are manufactured, they're synthesized in such a way as to have a chemical structure which is similar to, but not exactly the same as, another drug. Again, in this case it is fentanyl. Now the reasons why manufacturers might do this are many, but they can include trying to develop a new form of a drug which has greater efficacy or better safety. They can also include deliberately making analog structures so as to skirt or to bypass regulations for existing drugs. And there are rather complicated regulations around how opioid analgesics like fentanyl are manufactured and distributed and prescribed. If you're a manufacturer who is less than ethical, you might be motivated to create near approximations of a drug like fentanyl so you can sell it semi-legally on the gray market or over the internet. And actually, as a whole separate related issue, the manufacture of synthetic analog versions of drugs is itself an interesting and problematic public health crisis that's occurred over the last several decades. So there are many synthetic drugs out there, synthetic versions of marijuana, synthetic versions of LSD, synthetic versions of opiate analgesics, as we see here, that are all designed to be, if not exactly legal, at least semi-legal or easier to sell, to produce and to sell if you're not particularly ethical or not particularly concerned about the safety of your buyers. Now, reading a news story like this hopefully raises for you a number of different questions. So you might, for instance, be asking, well, how do different drugs work? Like, for instance, how does fentanyl work? How do other drugs which are opiates or analgesics work? How do they change the way we experience our thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors? What about a drug like fentanyl makes it dangerous? Why is it that you can overdose or even die from an overdose of fentanyl? one of the points that I'm going to try to return to again and again throughout this semester is that we have to ask questions about drugs, because drugs are all around us. Even if we at the very moment are not using drugs, don't think of ourselves as drug users, drugs are part of the world, they're part of our lives, and we're obliged to think carefully about them. And that thinking process hopefully involves asking good questions and searching for answers. Now, reading this recent story reminded me of a news story I read almost a year ago, and this concerned a piece of research that had at the time been published in a journal from the American Medical Association, and it concerned the use of medical marijuana and the use of painkillers like fentanyl in different states which had recently enacted laws about the medical use of marijuana. The basic idea of this study, and I'll link to it on the Blackboard site for our class, is that there have been a handful of states which have laws allowing for the medical use of marijuana, and they've had those laws for a number of years. Those, for instance, include California, Oregon, and Washington, which have had medical marijuana laws since before 1999. And then more recently, there have been a number of states, including Alaska, Colorado, Hawaii, Maine, Michigan, Montana, etc., who have moved to enact laws to make marijuana available for medical purposes. Now, the particular reasons why different states have made these moves are fairly complicated, but one argument that's sometimes made in favor of changing laws to allow marijuana to be used medically is that marijuana can be used effectively to manage pain, so say some folks, and that if we have medical marijuana available for pain management, people will be less inclined to use more dangerous drugs like the opioid analgesics. Now, in support of this argument, some of the research that these particular authors did showed that over time, the rates of mortality from opioid analgesic overdose have tended to increase. So if you just look across this graph here from 1999 to 2010, generally speaking, more and more people each year are dying from overdoses of opioid analgesics. And like I said earlier, that's not, unfortunately, that's not news to us. We've known about that for a couple decades. The misuse and the abuse of opioid analgesics is a big problem, and it results in a lot of injury and death. And you can also see here in this graph that in the slightly pale blue line, we see that increasing mortality over time for states which have medical marijuana laws, and we can see in the black line, the darker line, increasing mortality also in states that don't have medical marijuana laws. Now, if you just look at the graphs, or I'm sorry, if you look at these two lines, you might conclude that, yeah, in states which have medical marijuana laws, there tend to be, in any given year, higher levels of mortality than in states without medical marijuana laws. That's generally speaking true. So it's not that having medical marijuana laws means that there is no death by overdose from opioid analgesics. In fact, in states that have those laws, we see, at least in this data set, higher rates of mortality. But what the researchers who wrote up these analyses point out is that among states that have adopted these laws relatively recently, there's kind of a plateauing of the increase in mortality. So if you focus here just on the right-hand side of the graph, kind of years 2007 through 2010, when a number of states brought their marijuana laws online, the researchers argue that what you see is that increase stops and kind of flattens and even apparently starts to decline in the years 2009 to 2010 for those states with medical marijuana laws. In comparison, the states without medical marijuana laws see a relatively steady increase over that same time period. Indeed, the researchers attempted a second series of analyses that showed that if you count the number of years since a law has been enacted for medical marijuana in a given state, and for each year you track the change in mortality rate, that as more time goes by for a given state that's not adopted medical marijuana laws, we see a slight decline in mortality. This decline is not particularly steady. It hangs at about a 20% decline relative to pre-law levels. But as years go by, it seems to drop at least a little bit, out to, say, year 6 after a given state has adopted a medical marijuana law. The rates of mortality have declined by a little over 30% as compared to the years prior to when that given state has adopted those laws. So this is kind of interesting. It presents us with some data to think about the difference apparently, or the potential benefits of using one class of drugs as compared to another class of drugs. So just as a quick review, this class of drugs, the opioid analgesics, include the drug fentanyl, but also include a lot of other drugs, some of which you've probably heard of, like OxyContin and Vicodin. And as I said before, these drugs are powerful painkillers. They are very useful for medical purposes. If you talk to any doctor or nurse or healthcare professional who has any use with them, he or she will tell you, when used correctly, they can be very helpful for managing pain, especially very serious pain in people who really need the help. However, like I said before, these drugs can be fairly easily misused or abused, and in our own region of the country, that is in North Dakota, where I'm recording now, there have in recent years been a number of overdose deaths related to these drugs. So in 2014, there were in the Grand Forks region about 10 or 12 deaths related to fentanyl, which at the time was more than any other class of illegal drug. So not counting things like alcohol and cigarettes, alcohol especially being related to a lot of accidental deaths, drunk driving, etc. If you just look at the illegal drugs, or drugs which are being used illegally, fentanyl and other opioid analgesics are resulting in a relatively large number of deaths for a relatively small community, Grand Forks, North Dakota. More recently in Fargo in 2016, we're not even through 2016 yet at the time that I'm recording, there have already been about 10 deaths related to either fentanyl or heroin. Now clearly fentanyl is a medical drug which can be used legally. It can also be used illegally. Heroin's an illegal drug. I tried to disaggregate the deaths to figure out how many of those 10 are related to fentanyl, how many are related to heroin, but I couldn't find a precise disaggregation. But just in general, 10 deaths is a lot of deaths. Certainly it's very tragic for those families and friends involved. And that at least has something to do with the use of opiate drugs, whether opiate analgesic medications like fentanyl or heroin, a street opiate. So we have a class of drugs which are very good at treating pain, but which can be misused, and when they are misused can be quite dangerous or even deadly. Another class of drugs, or really one drug, it's medical marijuana, which has some interesting pain management effects. Now later in this semester I'll do a lecture or two actually where I talk about marijuana, and I talk about how among its other effects it does seem to dampen pain, make people less susceptible or less bothered by pain. So it can be potentially an alternative for pain management, especially an alternative which doesn't seem to carry the same risk for overdose and death. It's certainly people can have trouble with marijuana, and I will talk about that a little bit later in the semester, but there are few to no recorded deaths of overdose from marijuana or other cannabis-related products. So it seems at least potentially relatively safer than opiates, and some of the research I briefly touched on earlier kind of suggests that this may be the case, that if states adopt laws allowing marijuana to be used as a pain management medication, they may expect to see declines in the otherwise increasing levels of mortality associated with opiates. But this is safe, but how safe is it? How much safer is marijuana than using opiates or than using other classes of drugs? Again, this is a news story that is playing out in different states around the country. It's also relatively local to where I'm recording. In Moorhead, Minnesota, there is a medical marijuana dispensary that is scheduled to open up this summer. It's part of a company called Minnesota Medical Solutions. Interestingly, that clinic was scheduled to open last summer. I remember trying to contact the owners to conduct an interview for this class, but they hadn't yet opened. They pushed back the opening till this summer. I'm not exactly sure why, but I am very interested to meet the folks who work there and talk to them about the types of clients they see, the types of problems that people present for, so that I can understand better what is medical marijuana, how do people use it, is it in fact a safer alternative to other forms of medication, including some like the opioid analgesics, which can be in some cases potentially very dangerous. So like I said before, reading news stories like this, it's interesting. I try to do it almost every day. One of the reasons I do is it helps prompt me to ask interesting questions. So reading this news story over, learning a little bit about medical marijuana causes me, or hopefully causes you, to ask the question, what is medical marijuana? Is that any different from non-medical marijuana? What makes marijuana medical or not? Maybe asking more generally, why is marijuana illegal? In many places around the country, indeed many places around the world, it's a drug that's illegal to use for most people. And of course, you may be asking, what are the risks associated with marijuana? I kind of framed this as a comparison between two drug groups, one that's quite dangerous and one that seems relatively less dangerous. But if you're careful and you're thoughtful, you may be thinking, well, gosh, marijuana may be relatively safe, but it may still have its own risks or dangers associated with it. You may wonder, does marijuana use, maybe especially over long periods of time, damage the body or especially the brain? You may wonder, can people become addicted to marijuana? And you may even wonder if using marijuana increases the risk of using other drugs. So perhaps marijuana in and of itself isn't particularly dangerous, but does it increase the risk that you might, after using marijuana, graduate to using more dangerous drugs, which could really damage your health or even cost you your life? Like I said before, when you think about drugs, especially when you read news articles, especially news articles in your own local area about drugs, hopefully you have questions. Hopefully you start to wonder what's going on. If you do, I think you're touching on one of the really most important points about this class. Like I said before, drugs are part of the world around us. Almost everyone uses drugs at least at some point in their life. Even if you don't think of yourself as a drug user, you probably have used drugs fairly recently for one purpose or another. And even if you somehow have managed to not use any drugs for a very long time, you certainly know people who have used drugs. I would say we're obliged to think about drugs. They're part of the world around us. They're part of culture. They're part of the lifestyle that almost everyone leads. And thinking about drugs hopefully involves asking good questions and trying to find good answers to those questions. And that's a real motivation for me to run this class, for me to work on this class every year when I teach it. And hopefully it's a motivation for you to sign up for the class and pay attention to all these lectures and hopefully learn something. So with that all in mind, let's do a quick overview of what the class will be about. I'm going to briefly talk about why you should take this class. I guess I've already touched on that, but I'll return to those points. I'll talk a little bit about the topics we'll cover in this class and the structure of the different lectures that I'll be presenting in the coming days. Talk a little bit about the text for the class, and talk a little bit about the grading scale. Okay, so let's start with a little bit about the class. Like I said before, why should you take this class? Well, hopefully you're taking this class because you want to learn about drug use, learn about drug abuse, kind of like we've asked before, how do drugs work? How do they have their effects? Why do people take them? You may be taking this class because you're interested in treatments that are available for people who have drug use disorders. You may be wondering, how do we help people who have problems with drugs, who are abusing them or are dependent or addicted to them? You may also just be taking this class because you want to develop your critical thinking skills. Like I said before, I really think that we are obliged to think about drugs even if we don't use them or if we don't think of ourselves as drug users. So what topics will we be covering? Well, in the first week of the class, this being the summer of 2016, I'm teaching this class in 4 weeks, so we're going fairly quickly. In the first week of the class, I'll do what I'm thinking of as my introduction. I'll talk generally about patterns of drug use behaviors. How prevalent is the use of different sorts of drugs? How have rates of drug use changed over time? And what do we know about some of the reasons that people report for using or not using drugs? A lot of the lectures in this portion of the semester will focus on large-scale survey data where we ask people about their use of drugs, their reasons for using drugs, or their reasons for not using drugs. In the second week of the class, we'll do a focus on drugs in the body and drugs in the brain, and we'll give a quick overview to the tremendously interesting areas of neurobiology and pharmacology of drug use. We can try and figure out how is it that drugs enter into the body and begin to influence the body, especially the nervous system, especially the brain. Why do some drugs influence some parts of the brain, other drugs influence other parts of the brain? How do these different patterns of influence affect the way that drug use feels to the user, or the types of behaviors that he or she engages in, and so on. Once we've got the basics out of the way, we'll focus on some common drugs, drugs which you're probably familiar with, drugs which you may use yourself. These are the legal drugs. I'm going to focus on alcohol and caffeine and nicotine. Again, drugs that you almost certainly have some experience with. I think understanding them is tremendously interesting, both for your own use, so that the next time you drink some caffeine or the next time you drink some alcohol, you can understand why it's working in your body the way it is. Also because these drugs, because they're legal, are commonly used. So we have a lot of information about why they work, how they work, and so on. And the last week of the class, that's week 4, we'll cover the illegal drugs. And there are a lot of them, but I'm going to focus on sedatives, stimulants, opiates, of course I've already mentioned them a little bit, hallucinogens, and marijuana. Marijuana gets its own lectures because it's so interesting. Now, at this point, you may wonder, what about treatment? He hasn't yet mentioned treatment for drug use disorders. When I teach this class during the fall of the semester at NDSU, I usually do separate lectures on treatment. In the summer, it's hard to fit separate lectures in. So instead what I do is try and fold in each lecture on each drug a little bit about how drug use disorders with that drug are treated. So don't worry, if you're interested in that stuff, we won't miss it. You'll get at least a little bit of information about how we treat addiction to sedatives, to stimulants, to opiates, and so on and so on. A little bit more information about the class. The text we will be using is Buzzed, the Straight Facts About the Most Used and Abused Drugs from Alcohol to Ecstasy by Cynthia Kuhn and colleagues. This book has been out for a number of years in different editions, and I've owned probably most of them at this point. I'm looking over at my bookshelf right now. It's a really excellent survey of different types of drugs. It gives you a lot of information, and it's kind of set at the level of a well-informed undergraduate. So if you've had a little bit of classes in biology or psychology, it'll be easy to read, but will also provide a level of sophistication that I think will reward your reading. What I also like about the book is that it is inexpensive. It's a popular press book. You can find it at pretty much any bookstore. You can order it easily online. You can order or you can purchase or rent electronic copies easily online, and it's inexpensive. If you're used to paying, hundreds of dollars for your textbook, you'll probably be pleasantly surprised that this textbook or that this book is $20 or perhaps even less. So please get it. It's well worth reading, and it's a fantastic reference. If you get the text, or even if you don't, just understand that we're covering about one topic per day. A topic is often a particular drug, or it might be a particular issue like pharmacology or neurobiology. So typically there'll be 1 or 2, maybe sometimes even 3 lectures that will be available to you online that day. If you look at the syllabus, there'll usually be a corresponding chapter in the book Buzzed for you to read, and your job is to pay attention to those lectures, read the text, and then ask questions in the discussion boards. Pay attention to what you're seeing and what you're hearing. And if you don't quite understand things, or if you're curious, or if you want to know more, interact with me by posting questions in the discussion boards. Now, of course, you can email me directly. That's okay, but I much prefer that you leave comments to the videos or post questions in the discussion board so that I can answer a question in a way that other people can see and don't have to answer the same question again and again from different people emailing me. That's not that big a deal, but it's something that is a little bit easier for me. Now, if you're enrolled in this class in the summer of 2016, you almost certainly know that the class Blackboard site is available at this address here. You've probably found it already. The class content that you can expect to see there are things like announcements, outlines for the lectures, quizzes, which will be where you'll get your grades for the class, discussion board, other interesting stuff that I find, and so on. If you're not enrolled for the class, if you just stumbled onto this video on YouTube, you can't access the Blackboard site, but you can certainly leave comments for me in the field underneath the videos. I do my best to keep up with my YouTube channel and answer questions that people ask. So that's another way to interact with me if you want. Now, across the short semester, there will be some quizzes. There'll be one per topic, meaning there'll be one quiz for each drug, and there'll be one quiz for neurobiology, one quiz for pharmacology, etc. Each quiz will be based on the text and the lecture material, although to be clear, there won't be questions based only on the text. So I won't try and be tricky and ask you a question that you would only know if you read the text, but not if you only paid attention to the lecture. Most of the questions I ask will be directly from my lecture. Some of them will appear in both the lectures and the text. That's deliberate, so that I'm asking you about material that hopefully you've seen a couple different times. I'm not trying to catch people who have chosen not to buy the text. But again, from the lectures and text, especially from the lectures, about 10 or 15 questions. It'll vary somewhat. Some of the topics I'll want to ask more questions about, like marijuana. Some I'll probably want to ask less about, like caffeine, relatively simple drug. In total, there'll be 180 points that you can earn across all of the quizzes. The class also involves discussion board participation. I'll ask questions on the discussion boards. I'll respond to questions that you've asked me. Hopefully we'll have some opportunities for you to apply what you've learned in the lectures and in the reading to practical problems or real life news stories, or hopefully you'll see something online that will be interesting to you and will echo with some of the stuff we've covered in the lectures. To be clear, participating on the discussion board is ungraded, so you don't get extra points if you post live questions, and you don't lose points if you don't post any questions. But I do strongly encourage you to use the discussion boards to interact with me and to interact with other students in the class. If you're taking this class online, it's very easy to feel kind of isolated, like you're just watching videos and answering questions all by yourself, and of course, in some respects you are, but you'll have a much better, I think, richer experience of the class if you take advantage of opportunities like the discussion boards to interact with me and to interact with other members of the class. I mentioned before that there are 180 points total. Those come just from the quizzes, and you can see here a breakdown of the point ranges that you need to earn an A, B, C, D, or an F for the class. So keep those in mind and monitor your progress as you go so you have a sense of the type of grade you're going to earn for the class. If you're struggling in the class and really having trouble, let me know. I can't raise your grade, but I can maybe offer you some encouragement, maybe give you some tips on how to better study or better prepare for the quizzes. Don't go at it alone. If you need help, ask for help, and I'll do my best to provide help. All right, thanks for paying attention all this time, sticking with me through this little overview of the class. Here's a preview for what's coming up next. I'm going to have a short lecture called Thinking About Drug Use, where I'm going to try to continue with this theme of asking and answering questions about drugs. I'm going to try and highlight some of the interesting messages, the sometimes contradictory messages that are out there in the media and kind of generally in our culture about drugs and drug use. I'm going to try and offer some basic definitions and ways of thinking about different types of drugs and different types of drug use behaviors. Hopefully this information will provide a bit of a framework that we'll use for further lectures in days to come. So I think it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to this lecture. I hope you are too. Again, thanks though for paying attention. Again, thank you for your attention. That's all for right now. Maybe take a pause, make yourself a cup of coffee, make yourself a cup of tea, let this information sink in. If you have questions about it, please post those questions in the comment section on YouTube or in the discussion boards on Blackboard if you're registered for my class. And I will be back with the next lecture very soon. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.